is, in the wake of severe weather, will international communities finally take action on climate change? Popular media has gone out of its way to incorporate real-world issues. And one example of this is SpongeBob. Because SpongeBob has decided to tackle the ever-important issue of climate change. In an episode titled The Never-Ending Summer, SpongeBob puts on his capitalist hat and decides to open a pool up underwater. And he realizes shortly that when it's cold outside, he doesn't get many customers. He decides to take the pipe from the Krusty Krab hut and use it to pump out carbon and heat up the world in order to bring in more customers. And as you can imagine, this didn't end up well, because the pool evaporated and no customers showed up as everyone ran away. This may seem eerily familiar, considering that our world seems to be in the same position right now. As the UN describes in a report published in April of 2022, we are in a now or never situation. If we don't act now, we may be facing the fatal consequences of climate change. But as you can see now, it's been a year and not much has seemed to change. And we continue to be in a now or never position with little to no action. And considering that right now we're seeing storms in the middle of April, it's important to ask today's question. In the wake of severe weather, will the international community finally take action on climate change? And the answer is yes, because the international community does not have a choice but to act. And they'll be doing this by first enacting more effective climate policies. Next, they'll be implementing a global tax rate on corporations before finally actually helping the countries that are most impacted by climate change. Because while SpongeBob's most effective and only policy was using a factory pipe to heat up the world, the global community needs to do a lot more than that if they want to reverse the effects. As the UN explains on October 26th of 2022, right now, countries are acting on climate change. We see policies. However, considering that we are in such a serious situation, the action that's occurring right now is not enough. And as the UN has a lofty goal of reaching zero emissions by 2030, it's not feasible with the rates that countries are going at right now. But as the KPMG adds in July 21st of 2022, right now we are actually seeing some sort of policies that would be effective to combating climate change, such as federal incentives. The Inflation Reduction Act was passed last year, and it involved incentives for consumers and corporations to not use as much carbon. But like many other bills, people seem to have forgotten this bill existed and also forgot the incentives that existed in the bill. As a result, even though we have policies, they're not actually being enforced. This makes them overall ineffective, and we're seeing no such progress on climate change. But while SpongeBob went out of his way to charge his customers more in the short time that he had customers, we also need to do the same except with corporations and make sure they pay more if they're using carbon. As the Washington Post explains on July 13th of 2022, one of the largest problems that we see with climate change is that corporations are able to avoid taxes. Tax evasion is a pressing issue. If there's a tax rate in one country, they can simply relocate to another country, finding a tax haven. But as Wired explains on March 24th, currently, corporations have probably the most dangerous rate of emissions. Considering it's hidden and they don't have many reports released on this, we actually don't really know the rates of emission. Since this is the case, it's even more important that we actually act on the emissions that they're emitting. And considering that KPMG furthers on July of 2022, they add that taxes drive behavior. If you're taxed to do something that you enjoy, or you're having to pay for emitting carbon, like the corporations, they'll be less inclined to continue with these operations. And since this is the case, we can avoid the tax evasion aspect by implementing it on a global scale. This will be one of the most fundamental actions that the world can take. But while SpongeBob went out of his way to exploit his community, it's important that the global community do its part to support the countries that are most affected. Because while climate change is something that we can mitigate, it's not something we can remove entirely. And the countries that continue to be the most affected are also the ones that actually don't emit the most carbon. As the UN explains on April 13th of 2022, the countries that continue to be the most affected are lower income countries, countries that are still developing, or third world countries. And as this continues, they aren't receiving the support that they need. The international community must do its part to actually help these countries out. As the IMF explains on April 12th of 2021, we can do this by funding agricultural efforts and supporting their infrastructure as a whole. Because if we can do this, countries may be in a better position to actually withstand the effects of severe climate events. So, when we look back at today's question, in the wake of severe weather events, will the international community finally take action? We understood that the answer is yes, because they'll be forced to take action. And they'll be doing this in three main ways. First, they'll be enacting more effective climate policies. Next, they'll implement a global tax rate before finally assisting the countries that are most effective and the most vulnerable of them all. So, well, SpongeBob may need a pool to evaporate and lose everyone in his community. Hopefully, the international community can act before our much bigger pools evaporate.